Welcome to another episode of the Impossible Life podcast. I'm your co-host, Nick Surface, and I'm looking across at a man who recently discovered they named a constellation after him called Kilikis Aggressiva. That's right, friends, the former Navy SEAL, Garrett Unkelbach, a man whose fame has now gone intergalactic. Don't ask me where that came from. It just literally fell out of the sky. Like, literally. There was no inspiration for that whatsoever.
You actually can name stars and star systems after people if you
I
pay
know.
for it. So
yeah.
maybe you'll name a star after me.
I mean, is that what my life is aiming towards, is to name a star after you rather than, like, I don't know, my kids or my wife or even myself? I don't know. Okay, anyways, today's episode is on training for war, and we alluded to it at the end of last week with an incredible teaser where Garrett talked about this episode. So that was when we were talking about heart and guarding your heart.
I promise this episode will be better than Nick's intro.
Okay. I mean, I hope so. I actually hope so because I thought my intro was solid. Anyways, so we're talking about training for war, and we're gonna go into a number of things. We're gonna talk about what the battlefield looks like, what training looks like, how to train, when to war, why you need to train. We're gonna get into this. This is really like a call for all men and for everyone out there to like wake up, right? Because there's a lot of people who are just like drifting through, happily entertained by whatever dancing monkeys in front of them or whatever social or financial or cultural pressure is on them, and they are completely asleep to the fact that they are truly at war and that they're losing, and then they're just drifting through it. So we're going to get into that. But one of the things that's important to understand this that we're going to talk about is standards. And when you understand you're at battle, like if you're not, your favorite quote, we might as well just start off with it from John Eldridge. You want to give it to the people?
Until you see your life in the context of war, you'll misinterpret 90% of what happens to you.
100%. And if you don't realize you're at war, compromise is okay, right? Because I'm not fighting that person anyway, so I don't really need to be. It's like, who cares? That's the thought process,
yeah,
right?
And the subtext to that, but the war is not about you.
That's right.
You are in a war, but the war is not against you.
Correct. Now, G, do you happen to know what the minimum tax rate is here in the U.S.? Random question.
Minimum?
Yeah.
Well, I guess the minimum would be below a certain income. It's zero tax.
Well, false. Well, yeah, I guess it would be. I mean, if you don't make anything, you don't get taxed anything. But the lowest federal tax bracket is 10%, right?
Yeah.
And the highest is 24%. Which, if you're in Europe, you're like,
it's over like 34,000 or something like that.
0 to 11,600 will get you 10%. Once you get from between 11,000 to 47,000, it's 12%. And then once you get above 47,000, it jumps up to 22, which is bit of a kicker. And if you get above 100,000, it's 24, and it keeps going up. But here's the thing, and this actually surprised me. When do you think was the first time that we paid federal income tax?
It's after World War II.
No, it wasn't. That would be cool if it was. First personal income tax was imposed by Congress in 1861 to raise revenue for the Civil War. Okay. Now, then they repealed the Tax Act in 1872. So keep in mind, our country's coming up on its 100th birthday, and there's no income tax. This is very much like, hey, like no federal income tax. The IRS doesn't even exist. So then in the 16th Amendment, they bring it back. It was ratified in 1909, which is actually not that long ago. And then it took effect in 1913 was when it actually came in. So the IRS itself is actually not that old. Like I know it's 162 years old. Officially, it was 1862 whenever that came in. That's actually, I don't know if that's accurate. I'm looking at that. Yeah, it was. That was when it came in. But the point I'm making here, you see how you go from it was a 1% tax to start with. And I'm making this point for a reason because we're going to come back to it later. It was a 1% tax when it started. Now it's a 10% minimum tax. And if you want to go all the way down the line, I mean, you can get up to 37% taxed, right? And
higher, better CPA.
Yeah, that would be the takeaway from there. But the point I'm making is that people when they did this, and we do this all the time, we're like, it's not that big a deal, right? That's not that big a deal. But here's the thing you have to ask yourself: what's it going to grow to, and what's it going to be? 200 years after you're dead. And this is for everybody out there that's got kids. You got to understand, this is why it's so important to understand what's at stake here, because you're either going to give your kids
the biggest tax is inflation.
Well, yeah,
you can't get out of that one.
No, that's exactly right. But what I was saying is, like, for everybody out there that has kids, you're either going to give your kids a fault that they have to overcome or a foundation that they're going to be able to build on.
Yeah.
And it starts with whether or not you make little compromises now, like, that's not that big a deal, or I don't really want to deal with that. And guess what? That now becomes a habit, and you're subconsciously, and without realizing it, handing your problems down to your kids for them to figure out. And that's for you and your family. How much more does that happen in a generational aspect? I use taxes kind of as a somewhat neutral one because I don't think anybody goes, I love taxes. I feel like we can all agree on that one. But there's other ones. I'm just going to say, for example, like our kids, we were talking about this downstairs when we were prepping. Our kids will grow up with gay marriage 100% having been a thing that's always been. Whereas I remember whenever obviously the massive battle that took place over that, and even before then, whenever that was like not even something in our culture. And so that's just a common example of something that I think
it's changed a lot from our grandparents.
For sure. Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly right. So I'm using some examples that are well known so that you can see what we're talking about. And we want to get into it, G. So first thing, man, like we talked a little bit about this last week, but where is the battlefield? Where's the battle taking place?
Yeah, we just the previous episode we talked about the heart and where the heart sits in between the spirit and the body, and the heart is a companion to the soul, which is your mind, your will, and your emotions. And we talked about the hearts and minds campaign, and that is where the real battlefield is. Within each of us, the battle is in your heart and it's in your mind. You're at war in your heart, which is your desire center. Just because I give my life to Christ and I've been transformed doesn't mean I'm never tempted again. Doesn't mean I have to still get rid of these things in my life and burn off a sinful nature, right? Just because I've had good thoughts doesn't mean I'll never have negative thoughts. I have to continue to war at those things. It's like Zig said about motivation. It's like a shower. You need to do it every day.
Yeah.
It's like being in shape. It's not, well, I bench pressed 415 pounds one time, so I'm good for the rest of my life.
Yeah, set.
No, I've got to continue to fight. I've got to continue to be at war in these things, in the areas that you are most at war, right? There's a war in your flesh.
Yeah.
Right. And not just, I don't mean just flesh in the way the Bible talks about it. I mean, there's war in your flesh just to stay healthy, right? You have to fight in that area. But the war that we're talking about, and predominantly what we're going to focus on in this podcast, is the war that's in your heart and your mind. Your heart is your desire center, and your mind is your thoughts and your emotional control.
Yeah. And so here's something I want everybody out there to think about. And I don't know if you've ever done this. Have you ever assessed yourself for what you're most susceptible to? I'm talking about like what you're actually, what's your, I don't know, temptation or sin or weakness of choice.
Yeah, think about it this way. One of the things that we would do in the military before we would go on the battlefield is we would do a threat assessment and ORM, which is operational risk management. So we would look at, like, for example, I was a JTAC, right? I was responsible for communicating with aircraft and dropping bombs. One of the things I would look at in all of my threat assessments is, are there any SAMs known to be in this area? SAMs are surface-to-air missiles, right? And Intel has a report of, this is so frustrating, right? But it's like where the enemy gets a hold of a lot of these. It's American equipment that we gave to partner forces, and then they got overrun and they just ran and left this stuff behind. And so the only thing that can, Israel and some other countries make, Russia makes this, China makes this type of technology, but in the areas that we were fighting, they weren't the only time they had the ability to shoot down American aircraft was when they had somehow gotten a hold of American surface-to-air missiles, right? So I say that to say, when I would go into an area, I had an intel report of how likely is it that the enemy we're fighting would have surface-to-air missiles. I have to be mindful of that and how I utilize the aircraft that I'm working with, right? So threat assessment. These are potential risks, potential dangers in my life, right? Like there's things that I do in my own personal life to prevent threats. Like there's some threats I don't want to have. Like I have some of my own personal rules about how I engage with women, right? I'm not, even if it's for a completely professional reason, I'm not going to put myself in a one-on-one setting with a woman ever, right? And so there's an understanding of what are the threats that I could face, and then operational risk management is how you look at those threats and say, here's how I reduce them. When we're going on the battlefield, we have this list of all the threats, right? And if you just assess the threat, if you just look at the threats, it's like, man, we're going to all die. This is a terrible situation. We shouldn't go. But operational risk management is how we mitigated them.
Right.
And so what Nick's talking about.
Yeah, very good.
And before you go on the battlefield, you need to understand what's coming up against you and what's your level of readiness and preparedness to face those things.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because I read Screw Tape Letters recently with some men that...
I love that book.
Yeah, I do too, man. We did it with Men of Light. Shout out to Chris Hudson, who also makes Freedom Plunge. And he has these groups literally all over the country. So I'm in one, and we read Screw Tape Letters. And one of the things that stood out to me was a lot of guys commented when we first started that it was really hard for them to shift into the perspective, because this letter is basically from a senior demon to a newer demon. And it's a very, very good book. But like a lot of guys were like, man, it's just hard to kind of put myself in, like I'm not used to being on the enemy side. And I remember I found that really interesting because I was thinking, man, I've asked myself if I was going to fly off the rails, what would be the things that would most likely take me down? That's why I don't drink, guys. I'm just being straight up.
You've got to know how the enemy is working against you.
Yep.
Right. And until this is doing part of operational risk management is really doing like a 360 assessment.
Yeah.
And when you're coming, like you're never just fighting inside of a vacuum.
Right.
You have an enemy who knows you,
Yeah.
has feelings about you, has information on you. And the Screw Tapes Letters is a great example of that, where it gives the understanding of the enemy knows it doesn't know what you've thought, but it knows what you've said.
Yeah.
It knows what you've done. And so based upon that, they have a data report of here's how we could attack them.
Yeah. And when you think about it like that, it's fascinating.
It should also make you be very careful of what comes out of your mouth.
Big time. Well, and also fun.
When you say things like, man, I would do anything to be successful.
Yeah.
Who hears
real,
that?
For real. Well, you do. And so does your enemy. So fun Garrett story real quick before we move on to our next point. Garrett and I were in Nashville. Garrett was talking to a very large company, and I went along with him. And as we were walking into this office building in Nashville, very big office building, walk in, it's typically what you see. They got like security barrier. I'm like thinking to myself, man, I wonder if they got sandwiches upstairs. Like I'm going to film Garrett. I'm going to meet some people. We're going to do some things. And he's like, that right there, that's a security fail. Those desks are way too high. I could be in here and all those people would be.
Well, simply like it's one of the, you just don't see those things. I see these things. I've been trained to see them. We walked into, the lobby of this, like, just think like a big, nice building, granite entryway, big glass doors. And we walk in, there's a security person there, but the desk is so tall, they can't see the front doors over the desk. And I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well,
I could just walk right through the front door with my assault rifle out and they wouldn't even see.
So this is what
they would have to stand up.
This is what he comments to me. He's like, those people would be dead before they even knew we were here. And I'm like, turkey sandwich. Oh, okay. Yeah, totally, bro. I was thinking the same thing. So that was
based upon your experiences, you'll examine threats in a different way.
I will, and I'll also know if they're going to have turkey sandwiches or not. Okay, so we talked about the battlefield, right, in your heart and mind. We've talked about that you need to know your weakness, but let's look at some of the most common tactics, because here's the things that I think shipwreck a bunch of men and a bunch of people in general. Number one, and we've talked about it on this podcast before, comfort. Like, think about this. We always think that, like, oh, the enemy's going to destroy you. You have a great quote, G, and I love it. You say, if the enemy can't destroy you... Oh, hold on. You say, if the enemy can't destroy you, he'll distract you. Yeah. And I love that quote so much because there's so much in that. We're going to get into distraction. But I feel like people go like, oh, Satan's out to get me. I'm going to be like, there's going to be these demons and all these people are going to come to my house. And you think like that's like, no. We don't need to do that. And wouldn't it be great if you were just comfortable to death?
This is an understanding of the battlefield that I like to give to me.
Yes.
Right. If you have like your children's church thought process of God and Satan,
very good.
You think that there's a scoreboard between God and Satan, and it's like, who's going to get more souls?
Right.
And this also comes from, and I won't spend time addressing all this, but this also comes from really a lot of the philosophy of the church in the last 50 years, which was basically just focused on winning souls.
Yeah.
And so if you had this understanding of the church, you'd think like, well, there's a scoreboard between God and Satan, and God's saying, if he gets more souls, he wins. And if Satan gets more souls, he wins. And so you would think that if that's the case, that's what Satan cares so much about. I really don't think that Satan cares that much if a man gives his life to Christ. I think he cares what he does with that man. Either like Satan sees us differently than we see ourselves. Satan looks at each man and says, that's a son of God, right? And the way I like to see that, or the way that I understand that Satan sees God, is imagine if you just so deeply hated somebody, right? And I hope if you're listening to this, you don't feel that way or don't have that from experience, but just imagine that you deeply, deeply hated someone and there's nothing that you could do to hurt them, like physically. You can't assault them. You can't go into their house. Right. And this is Satan and God. He can't hurt God. But he thinks, well, man, what could I do that would hurt God? What if I could turn his sons against him? What if I could make his sons deny him? What if I could make and this is, think about in Job, this is Satan before the throne, right? Talking about like Job is, chronologically, Job is one of the earliest characters in the Bible. And Satan standing before the throne saying, you see your son Job, he only loves you because of how easy his life is. Look how much he's had. He doesn't really love you. This is Satan's view of God. And so he's attacking Job in a way, or attacking God in a way, saying, if you'll let me hurt Job, I bet I could turn your sons against you. This is Satan's view of God. Right? He says, I can't hurt God, but I could hurt him by turning his sons against him. And so if you have that understanding, that's where it's like, man, Satan can't destroy me. Right? I've given my life to Christ. I'm serving Christ. Satan can't destroy me. But if he could make me live in a way that doesn't glorify God, if he could get me to turn my back or turn my heart against God, to Satan, that's a win. Because Satan's not trying, it's not a soul's battle. Satan's just trying to dishonor God.
Yeah. And I mean, and here in the US, I mean, there's so much comfort everywhere. Wouldn't it just be such a great thing to just keep pumping that drug and just until the people just don't even recognize it anymore?
And in the same way, like I just kind of gave a small picture of what the battlefield is, similar to what the Screw Tape Letters book does. When you have an understanding of the battlefield, you see it differently.
Yeah, big time.
Right? If you just like appeared on the battlefield, it's like, man, what's going on? There's chaos everywhere. But if you know the real war that's happening, you have a greater ability to understand what the enemy's doing, why they're doing what they're doing, how to outmaneuver them, how to overcome them.
Yes.
Right? So that's why it's so important that you understand the battlefield that you're on.
Yeah, and the next one I want to talk about is distraction. And I actually think these first two, comfort and distraction, actually we have 4 of them, and I think all of them are as common as the other ones. But distraction, and I'm not talking about cell phones. There's this quote from John Lennon that says, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans, right? And it's kind of like, oh yeah, that's totally true. But like, think about how much of your time is spent focused on just basic survival things. When you have a problem, what do you think about? Nothing but that problem. Do you see anything else, or are you aware of the direction your life's going in, or are you thinking about like, hey, what's my relationship going to be like with my kids or my wife in 20 years? No, you are fixated on whatever it is. Well, what are people's problems? I got to make enough money. I got to make sure I stay healthy.
It's all short-term time frame
orientation. That's exactly right. And you're gradually dropping your head down to where all you see is that thing. And these are normal pressures.
It's how great illusionists perform their tricks. Hey, look over here.
That's exactly right. And so many people are caught in that. And so once again, I'm going to reference Screw Tape Letters. He talks about that. He's like, if you can just keep them focused on the pressures of the day so that they're never asking big questions. I'm paraphrasing. He's like, you've got them. And I remember when I read that, it stuck out to me so much. And actually, I'm reading Outwitting the Devil by Napoleon Hill right now. And read that book.
Outwitting the Devil is like, it's the college version of Screw Tape Letters.
It really
Screw Tape Letters is middle school, high school. Outwitting the Devil is the college version.
Right. And Outwitting the Devil, I would say, needs to be taken with a large dose of spiritual wisdom, because otherwise you'll just be like, yeah, it's about money. Like, I just need to make money and use faith. Don't do that. So public caution there. But the point being, he touches on this as well, about how much he calls them drifters, and about how easy it is to just get people to, like, if they don't ever have any, as he says, definite aim for their life, what we would call intentionality or vision. Without vision, the people perish. Right. Well, what does without vision look like? Oh man, I need to get a job. I just need money.
It's survival.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's
survival
exactly
is
right.
Completely short term.
Yes,
right. And we've talked. I won't go into it today, but we've talked about it in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Right, all of the survival things keep you focused on the short term.
Right,
but your purpose, which is at the top of Maslow's hierarchy, is your self actualization in your purpose. It's looking much further down the road, and it's what you were created to be, and it's where you're in the best version of yourself.
Yeah, and I want to shout out to Norm, just because I love Norm and he loves time frame
Big
orientation.
Norm.
So Norm, just going to give you a shout just because we love you so much. But I remember one of the best things you ever said to me, G, was you and I've shared it before, but you had taken a big financial hit. Something happened in business, and I said, "Hey, are you going to be okay?" Because like we talk openly about this stuff, and you just said, "I'm never worried about that. I'm always zoomed out, making sure that I'm going the right direction. I'm not worried about whether I can make enough money for the month." And I remember that really, that hit me so much in the moment, and I just remember I was like, "What a great attitude to have." About being about looking where your life is going for intentionality, because what are you exceptional at? Hold on, you're exceptional in my opinion in a number of things, but identity, purpose, and focus, you have an uncommon ability or whatever you want to say. And so I would just encourage people, take that from you, because that's exceptional.
If you've ever done survival training in the military, it's not fun.
Right.
Yeah. Survival training is not eating. Survival training is how to start a fire when it's freezing cold outside. Survival training is we're going to put you in freezing cold water. Yeah. Like, I could go on and on. Survival training is not fun.
Right.
Okay. But if you've trained for it and if you're prepared for it, you're not afraid of it.
Right.
And what you heard from me in that moment was, well, man, like, are you going to be okay? And what I said was, if I have to survive, I'll survive.
Right.
I know how to survive. I know it won't be fun. I hope that doesn't come. I hope my house doesn't burn down and I'm sleeping outside. But you know what? I know how to sleep outside and I'll be fine.
That's so good, man. That's so good. Okay, the next two, and we spent.
If you don't know how to sleep outside, you will live so differently from the fear of, I don't know if I could. I would die. Like, I wouldn't die if my house burned down. I'd just be uncomfortable.
Right. Well, hopefully you wouldn't be in it. But yeah. A man who's resistant to flames. Garrett Unkelbach.
It was a proverbial house.
Okay.
It's a metaphorical house.
Oh, right. I wasn't sure if you were actually flame resistant. Are you?
Johnny Flame.
I would call you flame retardant, personally. Okay. So one of the next ones, and this is just such a common tactic, is negativity. Like how, and you'd be like, wait, that's on the list for common tactics to destroy you? Yeah, 100%. Once you go negative, man, what else is possible? All bad things. It's never a case of like, well, I went negative and thank God I did. It's always a case of you focus on the negative, you focus on the lack, and what does it do? It opens up to doubt, it opens you up to worry, it opens you up to fear, and suddenly you're nowhere to be seen.
Negativity shuts off your potential. You can't access your potential when you're negative.
Frick. Man, that's what Garrett does to me all the time. Well done. That was way better than what I just said. Anyways, the last thing is selfishness. And particularly for men, I want to highlight this. Part of selfishness is just being on your own because you want to have things your way. If you thought you were, think about it, what we said at the very beginning of this episode.
And just to back up really quick, remind everyone, we're talking about common tactics of the enemy.
Common tactics of the enemy. If you, Garrett, what was the worst thing that could happen to you when you were out with your team? If you were like running a mission?
Oh, well, I mean, there's a long list of things. Worst thing would be like if my team died and I was by myself. Also, worst would be like running out of ammo. It's a pretty bad situation.
Right.
Or being on the battlefield and not having a target.
Right. But think about the first thing you said, being on your own without your team. I mean, that you've said this before. Navy SEALs on their own are
called the SEAL teams.
That's
It's
exactly
not called
right.
the SEAL All-Stars.
So for men, because I think men are particularly worse at this, if you're out there and you don't realize that you're at battle, why wouldn't you just be on your own? It's not a big deal. Like, I don't really need friends. I don't need that. I'm an alpha. I'm on that grind. I'm taking that red pill, man. I'm monk mode. All that.
It's literally biblical. Like 2 are great, but 3 is even better.
Right.
It's a 3-stranded cord. When two come together, each can watch each other's back.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but it's so common, isn't it? I think it's one of the first things I've ever noticed. In Mighty Men, we always encourage people like, look, be connected, have accountability, have your 3. And because every time I've ever seen anybody leave Mighty Men or twist off, and we've had some guys do some crazy stuff, which I'm not going to share publicly, you go, whoa, what? Okay, who's close to them?
What was he thinking?
Yeah, what just happened? And you go, okay, who's close to them? Because you're trying to think like, hey, we need to reach out to this guy. And every time it's like, and as soon as you hear, it's like, okay, so that's what happened. It's you got isolated, you got on your own, and anything can sound like a good idea.
Yeah, because the other stories are, so-and-so was going to do something stupid, and then his 3 interrupted him. One of his 3 went to his house at midnight.
Exactly. Yeah, and I know you've done that, and I've had multiple times where I'm like, okay, check. Like, I mean, particularly a man I love deeply, your brother-in-law, Josh Lashway. He's like my ride or die. Like, we just text each other, okay, bro, this is the guy we're going to go mount up. Yep, sure. I was like getting ready for bed one time, and I got the text. I'm like, I'll get dressed.
All right.
Here we go. It's going to be a late night. But like, that's so necessary.
Yeah.
People need that. And I'm so grateful that I'm in a culture where we have that. So just to say, the battlefield's in the heart and mind. You need to assess yourself for where you're susceptible. You need to know the common tactics of comfort, distraction, negativity, selfishness, / being on your isolation. So, you say this, and you said the biggest thing you want people to take away from this episode is?
The biggest thing that I want people to understand, because we're talking about training for war, if you took away one takeaway from this episode, it's that you would always train. Every warrior culture throughout history, the ones that lasted, they had this thought process of, we always train for war. Whether we're in a peacetime, whether we're at war, whether we just finished war and we're headed towards peace, whether we're in peace, we think war's on the horizon, we're in war, you're always training. When we were going through like COVID and riots and all of that stuff, and people were like, oh man, like there was a short season where people were like, this is it. This is the apocalypse. This is like the pre-apocalypse. We're about to go into the apocalypse. People, like, I had people texting me like, man, we got to start getting ready.
Yeah.
Like, like it's coming. And to the people who text me that I was close with, I gave a little bit of correction in their thought process. To the other people who would text me that I wasn't close with, I didn't respond, because what I wanted to say was, right? This is my, like, if apocalypse does come and you're not ready, you're not on my team.
Right.
Right. Warriors are always ready for the battle. They don't wait for the battle to show up to start preparing. And these warriors are a different type of people. You know, I want to talk about this for a second. There's a really great book by Lieutenant Colonel Grossman. This was written during the Vietnam era. The book is called, he wrote 2 books called On Killing and On Combat. In his book, On Combat, he talks about, there's a great piece in the book where he talks about sheepdogs. And sheepdogs are these types of people. It's a reference to Aesop's fable. So I'll start there for a second. Aesop's fable, many of Aesop's fables talk about the wolves. And what were Aesop's fables? It's a character story. Okay. Most common Aesop's fable that people know is the tortoise and the hare.
Yeah.
Tortoise and the hare, right? When you hear that story as a kid, you don't think that you're a turtle. You don't think you're a rabbit. You see the characteristics of a turtle or a rabbit, and you see positive traits. Well, I don't want to be the guy who's lazy. I don't want to be the guy. You don't want to be the hare who, thinks it's all about him and has all the time. Like, there's lessons that you learn from these characters. You don't necessarily think that you are a turtle or a rabbit, but you learn from them. I say this to say this is how Aesop's fables work.
Yeah.
He talked about the wolves often, right? Wolves show up in many of his fables, and it's related to wolves and sheep. And what are the sheep in today's society? Like modern society exists because you have a large group of people who go to work, who do their jobs, who take care of their families, like who just generally do what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And culture today can make sheep such like a negative term.
For sure. Yeah.
All of Aesop's fables don't necessarily do that if you read them. He doesn't make sheep sound like dumb, docile, and stupid as a lot of like culture today likes to make them sound. Sheep were just the general population, right? That they're the ones who made things run. And then there's the wolves. And now I'm talking about these characters like the tortoise and the hare. Don't think that you're one or the other. Just see the characteristics, right? Sheep are people who just make society run. Wolves are the people who feast on the sheep,
right?
They see the sheep as an opportunity to eat, to take advantage of, to do as they want to with. And then there's a different characteristic. There's a different character, the sheepdog, and the sheepdog shows up in 2 or 3 of Aesop's fables. You see the character of the sheepdog. The sheepdog, lambs, sheep, they do not like sheepdogs because they look similar.
Right.
They have fangs and they tell them what to do. Right. Colonel Grossman in his book On Combat, he writes a fable of how the sheep chase off the sheepdog because he's mean. Right. He bears his fangs at them. He tells them what to do. The sheepdog stands between sheep and wolves. Right. There has always been a type of man. There's always been a breed of people. These are warriors who stand between sheep and wolves, who protect society so that it can continue to exist. When you remove sheepdogs from the equation, the wolves will feast on the lambs. Right. They will feast on the sheep. And so cultures and societies need sheepdogs. These people who they're not necessarily sheep, but they're willing to stand watch. They're willing to do what it takes. They're made a little bit differently, and they're willing to bleed. They're willing to get into fights with the wolves. In Aesop's fables, sometimes you see the sheep outsmart the wolves or avoid them, but they never fight them.
Right.
It's the sheepdogs who can fight the wolves.
Yeah, that's so good, G. And that's what you're talking about whenever you're saying that you have to cultivate that warrior culture, that sheepdog culture of like, hey, I know what I'm about. And I'm not looking for war, but I'm also not hiding from it. Like, I'm prepared, is what you said about if your house
warriors
burned down.
have to always be trained.
Yeah.
There's a difference between warriors and savages. Savages want to kill. Warriors don't want to kill. Warriors have it's Romans 12:18. Scripture says, if possible, live at peace with all men. Right? It's as much as it says, if possible, live at peace with all men as much as you can. Or it's something like that, and you can pull it up.
I will.
But what's interesting is the scripture says, if possible, right? It doesn't mean it's always the case. It means that there's times where you can't live at peace, and that for peace to exist, sometimes war has to happen. Then that's because evil exists.
Yes.
And someone has to fight evil, right?
Yeah.
That's why warriors exist.
It says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And I was actually reading the Colonel Grossman's sheepdog, what he writes about. And what he said, he says exactly what you said. He's like, it's not a negative to say sheep. He's like, but we know that sheep live in denial. That is what makes them sheep. They don't want to believe that there's evil in the world. They can accept the fact that fires can happen, which is why the fire extinguishers, fire sprinklers, and fire alarms and fire exits are throughout their kids' schools. But they're outraged at the idea of putting an armed police officer in their kids' school because they can't believe that there's somebody that's that evil. And he writes about this. Yep. It's man, very, very good. Anyways, okay, G. So yeah, and one of the things that you said, and this is part of why I wanted to highlight the thing with taxes. You said that when you're a warrior, standards are an absolute must because if you gave the example.
It's so talking about why you need warriors in culture, right? Sheeps will allow wolves who don't bear their fangs to draw very close to them.
Right.
Right. Sheepdogs know you don't belong here.
Right.
Warriors are the ones who hold a standard. And like, you know why the sheep will run the wolves off before they get a chance to attack? Because the sheepdog does not want to get in a fight with the wolf.
Right.
Right. He knows he'll pay a price for it. Right. He's going to get cut up. He's going to get bit. What the sheepdog wants most is to live at peace.
Right.
He doesn't. The wolf just wants to eat. The wolf wants to kill. The sheepdog is not that way. And so what standards do in a culture is they actually protect the peace that's supposed to happen. Sheep they naturally do not want conflict, right? And like you said, the way Colonel Grossman talks about it, doesn't want these things that even like imply that conflict can exist. They want to pretend it doesn't exist. And if you'll look away, the enemy will continue to draw close to you and draw closer. And he'll take a few inches at a time until he gets close enough that there's no way that you could get away from him.
Yeah.
Sheepdogs say, this is our place. You don't belong here. And they will not allow you to encroach even a step. That's why I love the scripture in 2 Samuel about Benaiah, one of my favorite characters in the Bible. And when you read the Bible, you have to, especially in 2 Samuel, there's this whole passage at the end of 2 Samuel where David tells the story of all of these mighty men. And the Bible says that all scripture is useful for teaching and for reproof, that we can grow and learn from it. Right. And so there's these scriptures in the Bible that just tell these feats of what men did. You know, this warrior did this, this warrior did this. And Benaiah is not he's not one of the most distinguished. He's not one of the three. He's not the captain of all the mighty men. But there's more written about Benaiah than any of the other mighty men listed in 2 Samuel. Yeah. And it says there's 3 great feats of Benaiah. And so when I've read this many times, and when I was reading it, I said, God, why is this here? Like, Holy Spirit, like, speak to me. I want the revelation of what this passage is about. Like, why is there just extra language written for Benaiah? It's more than just the record of his existence. Yeah. All his feats are recorded. With the other mighty men, it's like, so-and-so killed 600 guys.
Right. They said it, but they didn't go into detail.
But the record of there's description of what Benaiah did. And one of the 3 feats of Benaiah is that he went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. Right. And so this is a characteristics of a warrior. Benaiah was also, he served with David and with Solomon. He was Solomon's captain of guard. Benaiah was a fierce warrior. It didn't say he protected his family from an attacking lion. It says he pursued the lion.
Right.
He knew this lion had been prowling on his family's land, and he said, you don't belong here.
Right.
Right. That's what a warrior is going to do. Right. I will go and confront the enemy. Sheep do not want to confront the enemy. They want the enemy to not exist, and they want to look away. So standards within your life, right? And we're taking this metaphor of story between sheep and wolves and a sheepdog. We're taking this passage of Benaiah and how he fought, and we're saying this is the way that you have to live your life, always prepared for war. If you're not, I love what Thomas Paine said. He said, if trouble may come, let it come in my time so that my children can live in peace. Warriors are willing to pay a price, right? And again, this is like the tortoise and the hare. Maybe this isn't you. Maybe you don't aspire to be a sheepdog. God's called me to be a sheepdog. I want to raise up other men to be warriors. And if you feel the call on your life to be a warrior, you need to train. You need to always be ready for what is coming. And I hope, just like many of you hope, that war doesn't come. But if it does, I'm going to be ready. And I'm not just talking about physical war, which, by the way, we can go there if we want to in this episode. I'm not just talking about physical war. This is so much more about spiritual war. And the thing is, we bounce back and forth between peacetime and wartime in the physical world, but in the spiritual world, we're always at war.
Yeah, very
right?
good.
You get breath, you get pause in between the conflicts, but we're always at war. So there's no reason that you shouldn't be training. It's like Israel, right? They've been at war for their entire existence. Everyone in that culture trains. Everyone in the Israel culture joins the military, right? In this country, people are like, oh, I'll never have to fight in a war. I can live differently, right? We should live spiritually the way that the Israelites live physically, knowing that they've been at war for their entire existence.
Yeah, gee, that is so good. If that got you pumped up while you're listening to this, because it definitely got me. It's not very often that while we're doing this, I'll feel the flow, but that got me going, man. and we didn't plan this. If you're listening to this and what Garrett said about being a warrior resonates with you and you're like, that's me, I'm that guy, you need to come join us in Giant Killers. If you're listening to this in August 2024, it starts the very first week, the very first Friday in September. This is a very intentional investment of getting time with Garrett for it to be invested in for accountability, for relationship, and to truly be developed into a kingdom warrior. That is the whole point of it. It's a very small group. He's never done anything like this before. And the point is that we want to raise up people who can go out and truly be warriors that raise up other kingdom warriors because, hey, we're in battle, guys. We can't sit here and just be like, hey, we got a nice podcast.
It's to be a giant killer. Giant killers it's who David was in 1 Samuel 17. Before he killed Goliath, he said, I'm going to kill you, and the whole world will know that there's a God. It's more than just being a warrior. Giant killers are people who take ground for the kingdom. David didn't kill Goliath so that he could be rich, so that he could marry the king's daughter, so that he could prove his brothers that they were stupid. David killed Goliath so that people would know that there's a God. And so being a giant killer is a special breed of warrior.
Yeah, and that's why it's an application only type thing. And we're going to select these people because we want 15 guys who are about it. So if that's you, go to theimpossible.life/giant killers, and we would love to look over your application. All right, so to that point, G, I mean, you actually, when we were preparing for this, you showed me something that like you loved from the 300.
I wasn't going to use it as a reference, but you wanted me to. I wanted you to see it. There's a scene that I love from, if you've listened to the show, you know that I love movies. And there's a scene in 300 that I love, and this is when they're marching off to war. And if you know the in-depth story of Sparta, right? They didn't march their whole army. They just marched. Leonidas chose to march. The council wasn't with him, but he chose to march off his group of 300 to go and fight off the Persians, and they run into the Greeks. And the Greeks are like, man, like, where are all of your warriors? I thought Sparta, we had heard that Sparta was on the warpath, that they were going to war. I guess not. And so Leonidas responds, and he starts to ask me, he says, you there, what's your profession? And the guy says, I'm a potter. Another guy, I'm a sculptor. How about you? I'm a blacksmith. Then he asks all of his men, what is your profession? Right? And they respond with their war chant. They're all warriors. One of my favorite fictional books is historical fiction, is the book Gates of Fire, which it tells the Battle of Thermopylae in it. But it also gives like the history and the story of the Agoge and how these men trained from the time that they're little boys to prepare for war. Yeah. And it was a very different, having experienced, certainly not what Spartan warfare, but having experienced warfare and the way people feel about it, I can understand this. The Spartans stood on the battlefield. At 19 years old, these men had spent a decade preparing for war, and they looked at their enemy, whose profession was potter or sculptor, who was afraid to be there, and he said, I'm going to kill all of you. I've been waiting my entire life for this moment. I've been preparing for a decade. You hope this moment would never come. I've been preparing for this moment since I was a little boy. Yeah. Right? It's two very different situations. And a lot of people end up in war wishing they had never been there. I've thought many times about it, about World War II. And how many men fought in war who never wanted to be there. Yeah. And I can't imagine that's really where war is hell. War is hell, but if you're a warrior and you've spent your entire life preparing for it, you can at least walk through it. You're not drowning in fear the entire time that you're there.
Yeah, so good, G. So I guess we need to tell people, like, how do you train, right? And the very first thing you said was always, often, and with intensity. Those are the very first things that you said when we were talking about this.
You have to train with the thought process of like, really, I hope this never comes. But think like the Spartans trained. I'm going to train as if it's kind of like I know, like you've heard some of my life thought process, right? Where I talk about Sandlot, where I talk about Benny the Jet and the Pickle. Yeah. I don't know what my moment is, but I'm going to prepare for it. This is the warfare that you're training for. You're training for your moment. You're training for your purpose. You're training that if battle comes to take my family, to take me, and I'm not talking about the physical. I'm talking about the spiritual. When the enemy comes and knocks on my door, I'll have spent my entire life preparing for this moment. That you don't have to turn and run, that you don't have to hide and hope that it's not there. Yeah. That there's a lion outside of your neighborhood and you say, well, I hope he doesn't come in my house. Right. Right. That you're the type of man that there's a lion in your neighborhood and you'll say, I'll kill him so he can't hurt any of my neighbors.
Yeah. I love that. All right, G, well, let's talk about that. Spirit, soul, and body. How would you train for spirit?
Spiritually, they're all very similar. It's really just different activities. Right. Right. If you're training for war and you know, it's like, well, I'll pull the old guns out once a year and and practice and see where I'm at, like you're not a warrior, right? When I was at SEAL Team 3, almost every day I was on the range, right? Like I was in the gym every day and I was on the range almost every single day. Just depended if the range was open and if I was in town. If I was in town, I was at the range. And so like the same way spiritually, you need to get in the word every single day.
Yeah.
You are exercising your spiritual muscle. Do not think that just going to church on Sunday or like I cracked my Bible open one time or I read a devotional for 5 minutes, right? Like you can't, if I'm going to go to the range, I'm not just going to shoot a mag.
Right.
Right. Like, oh, well, did it, check the box.
Yeah.
Right. If you're checking the box spiritually, you're not prepared for war. This is, and until you've been in those moments where like you've been confronted, I remember a guy that I was on my first deployment. There were guys that after our first combat interaction, they changed some of their gear, right? And like I confronted one of the guys about it, had an issue with it. It's like, why didn't you have this stuff already ready, right? Did you not think that we were going to get into a real conflict? Did you not think that like this was going to happen? You need to, but even still, when you face those moments, it'll shift you. Right. And what my request, my challenge of every man is that you wouldn't be someone that the enemy has to knock your door down before you decide it's time to get ready. It's time to train. Today is the day to get ready. Today is the day to train. Don't be a man that your time comes and you weren't ready for it.
Yeah, so good. So you said read your Bible every day.
So spiritually, let's read your Bible every day. And it's not, don't just read your Bible for 5 minutes, right? When you first start getting into working out, it's hard to work out for more than 15 minutes. But when you've become a real athlete, when you've developed yourself, you can work out for longer. The same is true in reading your Bible. You have to really sharpen yourself in this. Begin to develop your skills beyond just, well, I read my proverb of the day. If that's where you're at, that's great, but grow in it. Really dig into the word. Spend more time. Like, are you spending more than 60 minutes per week in the word?
Yeah.
I hope you are.
Yeah, that's fair. And then we also said prayer. And then the other one we put on there as well for training is discipleship. Not just you being discipled, but also discipling others.
And we did, but we won't go into that since it's all, we have 2 whole podcasts on that, a podcast on the phases of discipleship and a podcast on mentors. Right. And we did those recently. So go listen to those.
And that's, honestly, we put that in there because we wanted to remind you of what we said. Remember, common tactic, be alone. Nope. Train yourself in Bible and prayer and discipleship. There's plenty of people who are doing Bible and prayer on their own.
And someone who's guiding you.
Yeah.
I didn't go to the range and be like, I got this. I know what I'm doing. Right? Everything I learned from people who were world-class shooters. They didn't like this may sound interesting, or this may be new information. I don't even know if I've said this to you before, Nick, but the guys who taught us how to shoot weren't SEALs.
Yeah.
They were like world-class shooters. Now, we had SEAL instructors who would enhance some of the things they would do or modify it for like combat shooting, but we had the guys who they can shoot better than any SEAL.
They're competition shooters?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Well, in a specific, these were competition shooters who had refined their style of shooting to be combat ready. Right, because there's a difference between marksmanship and combat shooting. Right. But these guys shoot better than SEALs do. It's their profession. All they do is shoot. Right. And you think like, well, isn't that what SEALs do? Well, SEAls do a lot of things. Right. Right. These guys, all they do is shoot. They're the best shooters in the world, and they taught us how to shoot. Learn from people who are the best.
That's awesome. I didn't know. You hadn't told me that before. All right, next up, like we said, is soul. And this was the very first thing that you said.
Your soul is your mind, your will, and your emotions. And one of the things that you have to exercise the most in this category, this is where I see untrained men, is in emotional control. You just have to admit to yourself it's a choice, right? It's the same as... Like, and I know some men need to hear this. Your wife says something happens to you, and you lash out in anger. Yeah. This is the same as if I went to the gym with you and I pull the bar out over the rack for you, and you're like, I can lift this weight, but I don't want to. Right. It's heavy. I know it's heavy. I'm asking you to exercise with it. You need to get some reps in. The next time you get tested, the next time something or someone provokes you, why don't you just get some reps in and decide to be strong instead of complaining and saying, who's going to help me pick up this weight? Right. Right? It's the same thing. You can't. It's a choice. It hurts. Right? It doesn't feel good to control your emotions. It doesn't feel good to not lash out in anger when you're frustrated. But you can, and it is a choice. And if you'll realize it is a choice, that's when you can grow in it. When you say, like, I was talking to Nick about this the other day. This was a thought that I had. but age is based upon how you feel about your ability to change your problems, right? When you're 20 years old and your calf hurts, you're like, man, I need to stretch. Right? When you're 60 years old and your calf hurts, you says, man, there's something wrong with my calf. Right? And maybe, hopefully you're not 6 years old and feeling that way, but I'm saying that's a common example of where a lot of people are at with their problems. When you in youth, you feel like you can change them. As you get older, you feel like you can't change them. Why don't you decide to just stay young until the day that you die and look at every single one of your problems and say, I can change this. I can grow. I can be better.
Yeah, I love that. And we also put in there about relationships with emotional control for soul training, because it's a very conscious thing. Like, oh, well, you guys said discipleship before. Yes, we're also saying that you need to have relationship and fellowship.
Proverbs 27 is iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. That the iron part, the sharpening part, that's the soul part. Right. The word is going to sharpen your spirit, but a man will help sharpen your soul.
That's exactly right. And that sounds real great. Oh, I want to be sharpened. Well, let me tell you what sharpening feels like. It's uncomfortable. It's going to be you being challenged. It's going to be people telling you things about yourself that maybe aren't so great. I can tell you that what Garrett just talked about with emotional control, that's not something that I heard a lot about. And once you said it to me, it started to jump out. And guess what? I wasn't very good at it, right? And I had a lot of work to do on it. And I still do, man. I still do, to not be provoked and to be unprovocable.
It's this thought process, right? Something I've said before. I've had the snot beat out of me by people who can fight way better than me. I'm not a professional fighter, but I have never lost a fight to someone who is furious, right? And that's because they're so predictable. I'm not the best fighter. Like I'm not a professional at hand-to-hand, but I am a decent thinker.
Right.
And when someone is furious, it's so hard to, it's so easy to understand what they're going to do, what choices they're going to make. And in the same way, right, like the enemy can so easily manipulate you when you're angry. Yeah. So see yourself on the battlefield and decide to quit being so easily manipulated.
Yeah. When you associate anger with weakness, you'll never want to get angry again if you have any sort of self-respect or vision for your life. All right, very last thing, and this is probably the most obvious one, is body, right? I mean, not everyone's going to be trained for actual physical war like you have done, but like you should be training your body to be in shape. You should be working out. You should have some form of cold exposure, in my opinion.
You need to train it like where, even if you like knew, if I knew 100%, I would never have to fight. I would never have to go into combat. I would still train. I would still train my body, not just for health, but also we are a 3-part being. We're spirit, soul, and body. And you cannot be weak physically and growing spiritually. I'm not saying you like just because you're weak physically that you're weak spiritually, but if you are not strong physically, you are not as strong as you could be spiritually. Right? You will bring it down. You can try to outrun one and say, I just want to be fat and be strong spiritually. You can try to do that. But you'll never be as strong as you could be spiritually if you were also strong physically.
Yeah, I love that. And just to finish that out, I mean, we talked about cold exposure, diet, and just generally doing hard things. Because what Garrett just said, if you've not really pushed yourself beyond, when I tell people about our 100-mile experience or climbing the mountain or whatever thing that we've done, people will be like, oh, I don't know why you, like people will honestly be like, oh, I don't know why you would do that.
You know what sheep say? I hope I would never have to do that.
Exactly right. Because I remember asking people, I'm like, don't you wonder what you're capable of? And they didn't. Whereas I'm like, I do wonder what I'm capable of. And guess what? You find out by going and pushing yourself.
That may hurt somebody's feelings or frustrate you. And I'm not saying you have to run 100 miles to be a man.
No.
But if you have this thought process within you, if you've felt it, because we all have it, if you've felt it and recognized that it's wrong, that there's a part of me that's been seeking comfort, why don't you start to do hard things?
Yeah. A cold shower every day is not asking a lot, but I'll tell a very quick story.
That's why I like the ice bath, because it doesn't cost me a lot of time, but it is very hard.
Yeah. I'll tell you a very quick story, and then I want to wrap up with when to go to war. And I have a friend. He came out to stay with me a few years ago, and he was in an absolute crisis of life, right? In his marriage, in his there was literally not anything going right. Finances, career, like you name it. I mean, he still had his health, but it was just, he was in a bad place. He came out, he stayed with me for a week, and I was like, cool, you're just going to do everything I do. So we did ice baths. He went to Bible study. It's a man I've known for a long time, knew him from church. And it's really interesting because I hadn't seen him for a couple of years when we went out for our trip out there for what do we do in San Diego? I'm blanking on the name of it. Oh, for Legacy Navigators. I met up with him. He's one of my best friends. And he told me, he's like, I've done that cold shower every single day since I came to your house. It's part of my routine now. He's like, it has changed my life. And he told me about other people that he's passed it on to, because as he explained it, as we're saying to you, when you can get yourself under enough control, like, I don't want to do this, but I'm going to do it anyways, It's not about the cold shower. It's disciplining your mind. It's giving yourself soul control so that you can take that same, I don't want to, but I know this is good, so I'm going to choose it. Where does that apply? Well, we talked about emotional control. We talked about relationships. We talked about diet. It literally applies everywhere.
It's only irrelevant if you're clueless.
That's exactly right. Don't be clueless. All right, G. So when to go to war? Because based on what you're saying, right? You said we want to, we want to just go out there and just smash everything, right? I'm gonna load up and let's go.
That's savages want to kill,
right?
Warriors want to protect peace,
right?
And a warrior will go to, if it's not in your heart, like I have the desire to kill, but it is in your heart, I have the desire to protect. There will be times when warriors will strike first. You don't want to. This is America is such a warrior culture.
Yeah.
But there have also been times where America was slow to respond, right? This is Pearl Harbor and this is 9/11, right? There's opportunities where we could have prevented some things.
Yeah, for sure.
Where we got comfortable and we allowed things into our culture that led to calamity, right? Ideally, as a warrior, you want to stand such a strong watch and you want to have such a strong presence. I love the war policy of walk softly, carry a big stick. Be such a strong enemy be such a strong warrior that the enemy says it's not worth it to attack this man.
Yeah, I love that, man. And I mean, what you did say though is that you do want to strike first, right? I mean, you used Benaiah as the example. Whenever he went down to the lion,
he didn't wait for the lion to come into his village. He'd seen this lion in the hills, and he says, "Okay, I'm going to get rid of this enemy."
Yeah, exactly right. So here's the thing, G. So if you said the prereq is you have to be on watch. You want to strike first, and you want to stand in the gap as a warrior.
It's not an absolute. It's not an always strike first. But Benaiah is a great example of there will be times.
Right. So this comes to the question, like, how do you got to select your tactic, right? Because hypothetically, let's say you're out there and you're like, hey, like transgender ideology is coming into my school. I'm gonna go in there and I'm just gonna smash it. I'm gonna fight everybody in there, and I'm just gonna make sure that that's out of the school. I'm not necessarily disagreeing that you want to get out of your school. I don't want it in my kids' schools, and I don't want it in any school, to be honest. However, you also like have to select your tactic. For me, I talk to my kids openly about so many things that I'm like, hey, this is the kind of stuff you're gonna face. This is what people are gonna say. This is how they're gonna justify it, and this is why they're doing it. Let's talk about what the Word of God says. Let's talk about who we are. And I select the tactic of I'm going to strengthen my kids, because guess what? I may go smash it out in that area, and then they graduate, and they're going to go somewhere else where I'm not going to be. And then what? Right? So you like this is the thought process of it's not always like get your gun and rush to the front of the line. You have to select your tactic. And that's just one example that came to my mind, G. I mean, how would you, if someone said like, okay, how do I know when it's like wartime? What would you give them as like a
most of the war that we're going to do is war in ourselves, right?
Very good.
You've got to go to war. I was talking about this with the thought process of sin, right? We talked about this some on the last episode of like really the inception of sin. And inception, like really, if you want something to take root in your life, it's that you've gotten curious. You've responded to the question.
Very good.
Right? To go back to 300, when the Persians come to Leonidas and start to say like, hey, all that it would take is if you would just bow. He doesn't entertain the conversation, right? I've talked about like the inception thought process as, wouldn't it be nice if, right? And the Persians came to Leonidas and they said, wouldn't it be nice if you could just join Xerxes' army? Right? You wouldn't, like, your life could just get so much better. He'd bless you. He'd give all this stuff to you. He didn't entertain it. He said, we'll not be having this conversation.
Right.
Right. And so this is a violent thought process. Right. I'm not even going to consider it.
Right.
These are terms that you would ask me this question. We're going to war.
Right.
And that's the thought process that you have. That's that's the things that should provoke you to war. When things come in that try to tempt you down a wrong road, you don't say, well, let me think about it. Let me consider it. Right? I asked my wife inception questions. I said, wouldn't it be nice if this? And if she does consider it, inception takes root.
Right.
You have to realize when inception by the enemy is being performed on you. Well, wouldn't it be nice if you just looked at these things? Wouldn't it be nice if you could just live your life in this way? Wouldn't it be nice if you could just chill? Wouldn't it be nice if, you didn't have to give all your time to this or that? And that is that's a war question for me.
That's so good.
When those things are presented to me, we'll be going to war now. We're not going to have a conversation about this. And so that's what I mean about the strike first mentality of you've got to understand what your lines are, what these standards are. And if someone encroaches, it's very clear that when these lines are broken, we're going to war.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not going to back up on that. And this was just practically, this is one of the things that Obama was most criticized for. If you go back, a lot of people won't even remember this. It was like 2010, 2011 in Syria. When the Syrian president was just basically using chemical warfare on his own people. Three times Obama said, if you do that again, we're going to interfere. And it happened again. And it happened again.
Right.
And he drew his line in the sand. Right. I've heard people who are children's psychologists say, if you want to ruin your children, don't back up your threats. Right.
Oh, man.
When you say to your children, if you do this, this is going to happen, you have to do it. But warriors, you need to draw a line in the sand, but then you have to back it up.
Yeah, that's so good, G. Really, and I just want to remind everybody to catch what you said. You said you're warring mostly on yourself. So don't get your gun out and start pointing at all the external threats. Just a reminder, you got to look inside first.
Well, if you're, and that's where the biggest war is inside yourself. If you're so focused on war outside of you, it's because you don't want to do the war inside of you.
Yeah, very good. All right, G, anything else you want to give to the people on training for war besides train every day and get moving?
It's the biggest takeaway I want people to have from this podcast is to quit being apathetic with your life and to go to war with yourself, to train for war every single day so that you won't be someone who has to run from the battle.